Welcome to this episode of Substantial Matters, Life and Science of Parkinson's. I'm your host, Dan Keller. At the Parkinson's Foundation, we want all people with Parkinson's and their families to get the care and support they need. Better care starts with better research and leads to better lives. In this podcast series, we highlight the fruits of that research, the treatments and techniques that can help you live a better life now, as well as research that can bring a better tomorrow. Most people with Parkinson's disease begin treatment with levodopa, but in the future, treatments could potentially be delivered directly into the brain, either using cell-based or gene-based therapies. In our previous episode with Professor Roger Barker of Cambridge University in England, he discussed cell-based therapy. Here, he continues the discussion with gene-based therapy, what it is, how it is envisioned to be done, what symptoms it may alleviate, and the current state of the research. To set the stage, I first asked him what gene-based therapy means.
So gene-based therapy is an approach where people essentially engineer a gene which they then inject into the brain, and that gene will then infect cells in the area of the brain where it's been injected. And in Parkinson's disease, this has taken one of two routes, generally speaking. The first is to inject a gene which codes for a growth factor for dopamine cells and dopamine fibers, if you like, a sort of dopamine nerve cell fertilizer. And the second approach has been to inject a gene which contains the enzymes which allow you to make dopamine from its sort of basic ingredients. So that's a sort of recipe for making dopamine, and you inject that, so that will get taken up into cells, and those cells can now produce dopamine. So these are the two main approaches people have taken with gene therapy: fertilizer to make the dopamine cells in the brain grow and survive better, or a gene therapy to convert non-dopamine cells into dopamine-producing cells.
Is dopamine the only neurotransmitter that people are focusing on in Parkinson's disease in terms of gene therapy?
I mean, it's the main one. People have tried others. So there was a gene therapy trial done a number of years ago where they tried to convert a group of cells in a structure in the brain called the subthalamic nucleus and stop them being excitable cells, so producing positive signals, into negative cells by trying to change the transmitter which were contained within those nerve cells. So that was a different approach, if you like. It was a sort of gene therapy equivalent of deep brain stimulation. I mean, the results were interesting, and it's never clear whether there was some effect with it, as is often the case in these early experimental trials. But that's the only other trial I know of which has sought to look at a different transmitter to dopamine.
Was this the ones focusing on glutamic acid decarboxylase?
That's it. So that was the GAD trial, yeah.
How will genes be introduced into the brain?
If you like, it's the same as cells. At the moment, all of these therapies, if you want to get things into the brain, you have to directly inject it into the brain. So this is one of the disadvantages of gene-based therapies as they stand at the moment, which also applies to cell therapies and obviously is true of deep brain stimulation. So genes essentially have to be injected into the site where you want them to work. So you have to localize the area in the brain, and then the surgeon has to inject them into that part of the brain. And obviously that's an area which people worry about a lot because it's neurosurgery. In the world of neurosurgery, it's a relatively simple operation because they're trying to hit a relatively big target. And every day in neurosurgery, they're obviously having to take little samples away from abnormalities that are found on brain scans, such as tumors. So biopsy is something very routine in neurosurgery. This, if you like, is the opposite. It's just infusing something in an area where they think it's work optimally.
Are there also thoughts of temporarily opening the blood-brain barrier and giving the gene therapy more peripherally and letting it cross the blood-brain barrier?
Yeah, so people have thought about that. So it's a very good question. And obviously, if you could give something systemically, inject something into the bloodstream, and then open up the blood-brain barrier, which obviously is a barrier which prevents things normally getting from the blood into the brain at the sites where you want it, then that might be a clever way of doing it. I mean, people have thought about doing this. So people have used various different techniques, such as ultrasound, to try and open up the barrier. I think at the moment that's still very much in its infancy. I think the question will be the extent to which you can open up the blood-brain barrier for long enough to allow it to get in. Secondly, if it gets across the blood-brain barrier at that site, how far does it diffuse across the bit of the brain you want it to get to? And thirdly, if you give something systemically, obviously you want it to have its effect in the brain, but it is now being given systemically, so you'd have to work out where else does it go in the body and is it causing any problems anywhere else.
Would this sort of therapy mainly address motor symptoms or other symptoms as well?
So the gene therapy approach, if you like, is very similar to the dopamine cell therapy approach. It's all based and predicated on the same principle, which is you're trying to rescue the dopaminergic system outside the GAD trial we mentioned earlier. So fundamentally, it is targeting dopa-responsive elements of Parkinson's disease, which are predominantly motor. There are some cognitive problems, so there are some thinking problems which relate to abnormalities of dopamine within the basal ganglia, the structures deep within the brain compared to the surface of the brain, the cortex. So restoring dopamine in the striatum where it's lost in Parkinson's will predominantly help people's motor problems. There may be some cognitive benefits from it, but it will be very much more obvious in the sort of stiffness and rigidity and slowness of movement which characterizes Parkinson's disease. These therapies at the moment are not disease modifying. You could say if you put in a fertilizer for dopamine cells, you're slowing down the loss of those cells, which in some ways is disease modifying, but it's very unlikely you would actually be able to undo the disease process, which would eventually overwhelm any effect a fertilizer would have.
Where do these sorts of trials or experiments stand, especially in relation to, say, cell-based therapy?
They're pretty comparable at the moment. I mean, if one just quickly tracks back over the sort of history of these, I mean, cell-based therapies really began in the late 80s and were very dominant in the 1990s. And then they fell out of fashion because of some of the problems with side effects with these graft-induced dyskinesias, as well as the lack of efficacy in what seemed to be more formal, bigger trials. And the early part of this century, gene therapy started to come back and has been much more in vogue in the last 10 or 15 years. Both gene therapies using a thing called nurturing to try and grow the dopamine cells, the growth factor approach, versus gene therapies around dopamine replacement with two companies in particular, Voyager Therapeutics and Oxford Biomedica. They're still in the process of developing their therapies, so they're still ongoing in much the same way as cell therapies has now moved to a new phase where people are starting to use stem cell-based dopamine therapies, whereas in the past they've tended to use fetal dopamine cells. So I would say they're at a comparable stage at the moment in terms of they're both in trials at the moment, and it's an interesting question as to whether one will dominate over the other, because then whilst they're taking different approaches, they're still fundamentally targeting the same aspect of Parkinson's, namely the loss of the dopamine fibers and the dopamine innervation in the brain.
Looking ahead sometime, without specifying a real time frame, what do you see for the future of both cell-based therapy and gene therapy?
It's a very difficult question to answer because we're at a critical point, because these therapies, I think, have to be shown to have a marked benefit, which hasn't been the case yet, because the newer therapies have just not been in trials long enough. So I think the first thing is we have to show that these therapies really work, and they work in a consistent, robust way. The problem with fetal dopamine cells was they're very inconsistent. So far, the problem with the gene therapy trials is they haven't produced a big enough signal to make them competitive. So I think we have to wait and see whether they're really going to be competitive with the therapies we have there at the moment in terms of the size of effect and consistency of benefit. I think linked to that will then be the question of cost, because these are obviously not the cheapest therapies to make. So cost will become an issue as to whether these can be affordable in many places. Ultimately, though, if you say they are affordable and they produce an equivalent effect to that which you can see with the current treatments with deep brain stimulation and dopamine therapy, you can see them both competing for early stage disease. You could ultimately say, well, someone turns up with Parkinson's disease, we're pretty certain they've got it, we give them a test dose of dopamine, they respond very well to it, so we'll give you either a gene or a cell-based therapy, and if once we give you that in the early stage of disease, you don't need to take the drugs. Eventually, you will need something else, and the non-dopamine, non-motor aspects of the disease will become more prominent, and we'll need to treat those. But that would be the sort of vision I would see, that these in theory could replace everything we do in Parkinson's disease at the moment, because everything we do in Parkinson's disease at the moment fundamentally is around replacing dopamine with drugs.
What are some watchwords or cautions for people considering a gene or cell-based trial or something marketed actually as a therapy today?
So I think people need to be a bit cautious of this, because I think genes are probably safer because, in order to make a gene-based therapy, that requires quite a lot of investment. It's nearly always attached to a, very reputable company who's making it, and they will be the subject of formal trials. So I think it would be very hard to get into a gene therapy trial which wasn't through some route which was, fully justified, fully funded, and easy to verify as being the right thing to do if you were interested in being involved with it. Cell-based trials, I think there is this whole area of stem cell tourism where clinics and institutions around the globe offer unproven therapies with often patient testimonies saying how well it works with cells which are poorly defined and can be used for a whole host of conditions, of which Parkinson's disease is just one. For those, I would be very wary, especially if you're having to pay, because there's no reason you should pay for an experimental therapy. There are also, of course, a whole raft of other therapies outside cells and genes which are being advertised as curative or disease-modifying in Parkinson's disease. But as of today, there are no proven disease-modifying therapies in Parkinson's disease. That's not to say these therapies couldn't have a benefit and may be useful and may be disease-modifying. That's just unproven. So I think anyone who makes claims that they have a cure for this condition or a therapy that has proven efficacy in slowing down the disease, I think you need to view that with great caution.
I suppose it's also worth noting that nothing is really approved at this point, so everything is experimental.
It is. And, and I think people always worry about the fact that they're missing out on things and that, are these therapies being proven somewhere else and we just haven't seen them. But you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about is very much in the experimental phase, and all good trials will tell us something about how we proceed. Most trials fail in their first attempt. So one of the most important things is to learn as we go along, and hopefully, with time, we will learn things from these therapies which we can incorporate our next trials, and we will ultimately arrive at something which will be proven and will be licensed to work in the way that we hope.
Very good. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. You can find more on the topics of gene-based and cell-based therapies by going to Parkinson.org and searching on Roger Barker. You'll find an expert briefing he presented, as well as our previous podcast in which he discussed cell-based therapies. As Professor Barker advised, one has to be especially cautious when considering entering a trial of a cell-based therapy because there are many unethical claims being promulgated about such trials, or even promoting them as treatments. So, fortunately, there's an article in the search results titled Stem Cell Therapies for Parkinson's: 5 Questions to Ask Before Participating in a Clinical Trial. If you have questions about today's topic or anything else having to do with Parkinson's, our information specialist can provide answers in English or Spanish. You can reach them at 1-800-4PD-INFO. News and updates about future events and resources are available by joining our email list at the bottom of our website's homepage. If you want to leave feedback on this podcast or any other subject, you can do it at parkinson.org/feedback. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate and review the series on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. At the Parkinson's Foundation, our mission is to help every person diagnosed with Parkinson's live the best possible life today. To that end, we'll be bringing you a new episode in this podcast series every other week. Till next time, for more information and resources, visit parkinson.org or call our toll-free helpline at 1-800-4PD-INFO. That's 1-800-473-4636. Thank you for listening.